Good morning. I am Pia Malani, Senior Economist at INET and also Director of INET's Innovation Center. Welcome to all of you who are joining us for today's webinar on digital transformation, pre and post COVID-19. It is our last one for the season, and I'm particularly honored to welcome today's speaker, Jim Balsillie, who is a co-founder of INET and someone whose thinking aligns very closely with the research and work that we have been producing over the last decade. Jim wears many hats. He is the founder of the Center for International Governance Innovation, the founder of the Balsillie School of International Affairs and the Canadian International Council, and co-founder of Communitech. He is the co-founder and former co-CEO of Research in Motion, or as many of us know it, BlackBerry. He is also the recipient of many awards, including the Mobile World Congress Lifetime Achievement Award, India's Priyadarshini Academy Global Award, and Time Magazine World's 100 Most Influential People. Jim is also the founder of the Center for Digital Rights, an organization that works to advance the public's understanding of their rights and raise policymakers' understanding of digital technology and its economic and non-economic effects. At a time when so many of our lives have shifted online in response to COVID, the importance of understanding the civic rights of individuals in a data-driven economy becomes that much more critical. Also critical are the strategic and geopolitical realities being defined by this digital transformation. Jim is someone who has thought deeply about these issues, bringing his intuitive and experiential understanding of the forces that drive innovation and entrepreneurship. And I'm looking forward to hearing his framework for thinking about these questions. After the presentation, we will open it up for questions. So if you have any, you can go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type them in there, and we will get to as many as we can. Before we begin, INET's President Rob Johnson will say a few words. Rob?
I guess I'm feeling very warm about our speaker today. I remember in 2010 when George Soros called me. It was approximately February or March, and he had just had a wonderful conversation at the Brookings Institution, and he and Jim Balsillie, and then eventually Tom Burns and I started to explore, and within a week, they were going to be part of our first conference in early April. And they have been both prescient and at my side. And Jim, you've had change in leadership. You have an excellent president now of CIGI, Rohinton Medora, who's leading our subcommittee on Africa for the Commission on Global Economic Transformation. But I don't want to focus on your whole team. I want to focus on you, because I can't describe for this audience the number of times, whether it's at the World Economic Forum or sitting at the Center for International Governance Innovation, that we've done forums and you've sat next to me and you've illuminated territory that had never inhabited my imagination before. And what I'm most impressed by is how you create a synthesis between your practice and experience and the forward-looking ideas as a socially responsible citizen that we all have to embrace. And from early conversations like about the relationship between gunboats and the ability to defend intellectual property rights, and therefore where technology firms needed to be located in what was allegedly a multilateral system, to all kinds of explorations about the future of a digital economy, the ramifications for society, and just your choice of senior fellows, people like Kevin Carmichael, Paul Bluestein. And it's just, there is something that you're bringing to the world. And I love my BlackBerry, but I think you're going even higher. And so I want to thank you for joining us today. I'm very excited to take out my pen and pad and resume learning, just like I have in so many other contexts. But you're a great partner to INET. You have been for over a decade. You've brought many people and ideas and yourself and awareness. You used to teach me how to do high quality group online seminars. if that's not germane now, and they aren't as high quality as what you created in that room that you had in Waterloo, but how would I say? You're an impetus to our success. You're an impetus to our striving, and you're an extraordinary man, and we're very fortunate to have you as our speaker today.
Well, thank you, Rob, for those very kind and generous comments, and I appreciate that. And it's my pleasure to join today's webinar, and also thank you, Pia, for inviting me to present, and also for your work in INET, more specifically in your role as Director of the Center of Innovation, Growth and Society, and also to Rob for his just remarkable leadership of INET from the very beginning. And so I thank you for all you're doing in the research and the dialogue on the pressing economic issues of our time. When we founded INET on the heels of the 2009 financial crisis, much of our mandate was through the lens of recovery, with the objective of facilitating equality and prosperity through sound economic policy thinking. My lens of deeper interest, as Rob mentioned, then as in now, was to better understand the rules governing the digital transformation, which continues to rapidly reshape our global economy. So we fast forward to 2020, and we find ourselves in a time of crisis yet again. While we rely on science and the medical community to navigate us through the health component of this crisis, it is the responsibility of economic policymakers and those who advise them to facilitate a vibrant recovery plan adapted for our changed world. The COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated digital transformations and amplified their effects. My hope is that we can capitalize on this emergent clarity with appropriate policies and manage and capture the benefits of the knowledge-based economy and the data-driven economy while managing their downsides. I'll spend the first part of my presentation discussing the structure of this transformation, and then the second part on the updated toolkit of policy solutions and strategies needed to manage its effects. Over the past 3 decades, a new global rule of law framework has been forged to govern the way that innovation is incentivized and the way that gains from innovation are captured and distributed. The development of this framework was motivated first by the rise of the knowledge-based economy, in which the strategic focus of business shifted to generating and controlling traditional intellectual property assets, such as patents and copyrights. The framework has been further elaborated to reflect the emergence of the data-driven economy, in which the strategic focus of business shifted increasingly to generating and controlling data assets, as well as the valuable intellectual property developed on top of these data assets through the application of artificial intelligence and machine learning. This transformation has created a new kind of economy in which the basis of wealth and power is derived from control of these intangible assets. It has also created a new kind of social and political space in which both our public and private spheres are technologically reshaped. IP and data are now the world's most valuable business and national security assets. In 1976, 16% of the value of the S&P 500 was intangible. Today, intangibles comprise over 90% of the S&P's $27 trillion in total value. To give you a sense of scale, the world's 5 most valuable companies alone are worth well over $6.6 trillion. The vast majority of their market value is comprised of IP and data, not bricks and mortar or even machines. According to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, IP and data-intensive industries already contribute approximately $7 trillion annually to the U.S. economy. But as we know from current accounting of these impressive growth figures, this rising tide doesn't lift all boats, but instead only a few yachts. The tangible and intangible economies are fundamentally different in many ways. In the production-based industrial economy of tangibles, the ability to produce efficiently at scale and to sell at lower prices enables the capture of markets, which underpins profitability. In the traditional economy, trade agreements open foreign markets to gain greater access to production economies of scale. Competition naturally emerges from the removal of restrictions on commerce. efficiency is based on optimization of value chains on a global scale. The win-win dynamics of trade spread the benefits. The instruments designed to govern this international economy are properly called free trade agreements, and we currently have solid measurement tools to track their socio and economic impacts. But the intangible economy is based on amassing stocks of rent-generating assets that can be commercialized based on a principle of legal restriction. Digital products based on IP and data have effectively zero marginal production costs, which result in winner-take-all, or at least most, economics. Market opening thus drives concentration, not competition. The instruments designed to govern this type of global economy focus on the protection of IP and data assets. The main thrust of the so-called 21st century trade agreements, including the original TPP, CETA, and the recent USMCA, has been to entrench and expand protection for intangible assets. Frameworks for the control of intangible assets is also the main bone of contention in the current trade and technology war between the United States and China. With the shift from the tangible economy to the intangible economy, protection becomes the new liberalization. As Canadian economist Dan Chiriak has suggested, trade agreements are now more appropriately called asset value protection agreements. The intangible economy possesses ever-changing marketplace framework structures and interpretations with the objective to be the rent-collecting landlord rather than the rent-paying tenant or sharecropper. This system is inherently rivalrous, leading to mercantilist behavior by big powers flexing their muscles and shrewd national strategies by successful smaller economies. The pace of this shift is accelerating, as evidenced by the rapid rise in PCT and USPTO IP filings in the past few decades, as shown in the two charts in this slide. The Patent Cooperation Treaty is a 152-member country agreement that provides a unified procedure for filing international patents. A recent U.S. National Bureau of Economic Research report states, and I quote, "Patents are the most concrete and comparable measure of innovative output over countries and times," end of quote. They have a direct impact on wealth and power at both the firm level and nationally, which is why smart innovation countries focus on owning and protecting these assets. Strengthening global IP protections has been a deliberate, sustained, and successful U.S. policy, beginning with the 1988 Omnibus Trade and Competitiveness Act and the WTO's 1995 Trade-Related Aspects of IP Rights, or TRIPS provisions, and these continued right up to the TRIPS Plus provisions in both the TPP and the new USMCA. This digital transformation is being turbocharged by a big data tsunami sourced from a vast array of sensors that form the Internet of Things. IBM recently estimated that 90% of all the world's data has been created in the previous 2 years. Juniper Research estimates that the number of connected devices will grow to 46 billion by 2021. The scale of this shift in the source of market value recalls the shift in the source of wealth from land to capital that started with the Industrial Revolution and marked the transition from the feudal to the capitalist system. While equally profound in terms of its implications for the organization and governance of economy and society, the current shift is unprecedented in terms of its rapidity. In the intangible economy, the firm is the key agent of innovation because that's where commercialization occurs. The strategic operating principle for firms is called freedom to operate. Freedom to operate is at the core of the innovation economy because IP rights are by their very nature technical and legal monopolies. By owning IP, you restrict others from using a valuable idea, and then you collect economic rents when others use that idea. When a company does this well and at scale, they generate successful innovation outcomes for their stakeholders and their national economies. Successful freedom to operate strategies involve deep public-private engagement. However, competitive markets in the data-driven economy are failing because of data's economies of scale and scope, network externalities and information asymmetries, and this generates intense current activity by the US and EU competition authorities and regulators. IP and data have strong public good characteristics, so private decisions do not price the associated externalities or spillovers into their contractual agreements. They also have pervasive dual-use characteristics with the effects beyond the economy into social, security, health, and geopolitical realms. The EU is building its own cloud, not because Europeans lack faith in the multilateral trading system, but because EU policymakers understand that whoever owns the IP and whoever controls the data controls who and what interacts with it, and this has major implications for the prosperity, security, and democracy. As part of this fundamental shift, we've come to depend on the vast network of internet and telecommunications infrastructure developed for the open and rapid exchange of information and services. Big data assembled from ubiquitous sensors, coupled with ever more powerful AI and machine learning engines, and deployed through next generation 5G networks, are transforming this from passive infrastructure into a veritable digital nervous system. This slide is a Mandela schematic representation of how I think strategically about the cross-cutting issues that the digital transformation raises. It is about values, the distribution of wealth, preserving competitive markets, preserving privacy, health, maintaining the integrity of the democratic process, and very importantly, ensuring national security. Since AI sees the human being only in datafied form, the regulation of AI must be premised on private individuals having rights and recourse to remedies concerning the use of, if not control over, their data profile, commensurate with the human rights that private individuals have to control over how they present to society, themselves to society in the physical world. Also, given its social nature and public good characteristics of non-rivalry, data gives rise to spillovers or externalities, both good and bad. Any regulation of AI should thus explicitly address the consequences of these characteristics for human rights. This is why I argue that data governance is the most important public policy issue for our time. Whoever controls the data controls who and what interacts with it. Furthermore, any data collected can be reprocessed and analyzed in new ways in the future that are unanticipated at the time of collection. This notion alone has major implications for the global economy and for democracy, and we're seeing more and more of this become widespread and to larger demographics, particularly among our vulnerable population, including children. It is essential to look at data governance as an integrated whole because the exploitation of data generates a new feedback that modifies the behavior of the society and economy that generated the data in the first place. This is why I believe social media applications should be subject to regulation protective of the public interest, just as broadcasting is today. I would argue that data governance is even more urgent as a policy challenge than climate change because abuse of data compromises the very democratic process in which we rely to intelligently and effectively address challenges like climate change. For instance, a recent study by Neiman Labs showed that YouTube's algorithm is pushing climate misinformation videos, and their creators are profiting from it. We already know that Facebook's algorithms played a central role in creating the genocide in Myanmar. Quantitative social psychology that leveraged social media information was used to influence outcomes from scenarios such as Kenya's national election to Brexit and to Trump's 2016 presidential campaign. And of course, the sea of deliberate misinformation spread during the COVID-19 pandemic. Who or what will be next? Tailored national strategies are of the highest priority, which I will address in a couple of minutes. The data-driven economy is an unprecedented economic and societal force that is revolutionizing nearly every industry and leading to new power dynamics between countries, none greater than the current US-China trade and technology war, including the US's August escalations of a ban on WeChat, a divestiture order on TikTok, and the announcement of the Clean Telecommunications Networks Initiative. I'm all for a clean network, provided we have a proper definition of what clean embodies. Data capital stocks create critical new issues regarding ownership of data and national regulations for the data-driven economy. This is not a parochial or xenophobic instinct. It is simply a result of the fact that data ownership is akin to land ownership in feudal times. It makes those who control the data permanently wealthy and powerful, and leave those who supply data at the owner's mercy. This is very different from a production economy where the exchange of products based on comparative cost advantage and where global cooperation is of benefit to all parties. Because of its distinct properties, the data-driven economy has created rivalry systems between China, the US, and the EU. Each of these three economic regions is creating distinct and fundamentally divergent strategies consisting of rules, regulations, and international agreements that embed their norms, advantage their own economies, and advance their broader geostrategic interests. The Chinese quote on this slide is a good example of their deliberate and systemic approach to managing the digital transformation. China has its great firewall and aggressively supports national champions like Baidu, Tencent, and Alibaba. The US aggressively pushes for open data flows that support Silicon Valley superstar firms. Because Europe does not have large pre-existing data-driven companies, it takes a more defensive approach by focusing on data standards and regulation, such as GDPR and competition policy. But it too is now looking to go on the offensive, building on its digital single market policy. These three approaches beg important questions, such as how do we address the incompatibilities in these strategies, and what should the strategies of the rest of the world be? National industrial and security strategy is very different when you are the home country of one of these successful national champions, rather than being just a customer state. Compelling strategies for a small open economy and for a developing economy have yet to be set out. There's a global race underway by large firms and nation states to own critical IP, especially for key emerging areas such as blockchain, AI, and machine learning. China has taken a big page out of the US playbook with its industrial strategy for IP that involves specialized IP courts, IP education initiatives, aggressively participating in international marketplace framework structures such as standard setting organizations, and of course, amassing massive patent stocks. In 2017, China for the first time received more patent applications than the US, EU, Japan, and Korea combined. In 2018, China filed more than 30,000 public artificial intelligence patents, an impressive 10-fold jump in 5 years, and about 2.5 times more than the United States, which has surpassed for the lead. I noticed the state-sponsored hockey stick rise in Chinese patents in 2013 and concluded that this would inevitably collide within the WTO. In advanced policy circles, the competition to dominate AI has been characterized as AI nationalism or techno-nationalism. Machine learning is a general-purpose technology that will affect all sectors and parts of society. It leads to the winners gaining enormously enhanced economic, technological, and military powers. You cannot patent data, but you can patent around it and block access, even when the data is shared. With the protectionist state actions playing out in real time as part of this new geopolitical race, how this will play out post-pandemic is unclear, though I expect things will get more turbulent before there is a mutual agreement on a new set of frameworks. Encouragingly, the World Trade Organization is updating its orthodoxies right now, just beginning to recognize that foreign direct investment in intangibles is prone to extractive spillovers that warrant public sector intervention. We're in the midst of an historic technology-driven transition in the way value is created and captured in our economies, in how our societies function, and in the sources of national wealth and power. Here I lay out 4 core elements that must be resolved together to craft a stable system that can advance welfare globally. 1, safeguard national security in a digital and cyber era. 2, enable fair access to the new factors of production to participate in the value created in the knowledge-based and data-driven intangibles economy. 3, protect and even enhance citizen welfare in the non-economic realms for privacy, health, democracy, ethics. And of course, number 4, comply with all international commitments under various agreements, including GATS, TRIPS, and FTAs. I submit to you all today that the top 3, digital security, fair economic access, and preserving sovereignty over social choice, can be resolved together, and in fact can only be resolved satisfactorily if done together with appropriate national level implementations. Data-driven technologies are becoming the core infrastructure around which most of society operates, so states need to be able to shape approaches if the system is to be sustainable and accountable to citizens. Different countries will have different implementations. The EU's implementation places greater weight on privacy and circumscribes the ability to capture economic value. The United States places the emphasis on corporate capture of economic value, but national security is also a major interest. China primarily emphasizes national security, but economic value capture is also high on the list of priorities. The challenge comes with reconciling national level choices in these domains with commitments and trade agreements that were made under different technological conditions, and for the most part, in ignorance of the value proposition in terms of the international distribution of benefits, because the rising tide in this older system generally lifted all boats. Trade agreements have general exceptions to cover national security and fundamental social policy objectives. In principle, these exceptions can be called on to address problems as they surface. However, countries must be shrewd when it comes to their 21st century economic strategies, or they will be outmaneuvered by more sophisticated states and private companies, and in the process lose their security, sovereignty, and a fair shake at capturing their share of potential economic returns. So pay close attention to who controls the data. Many intangible stock assets have pervasive dual-use characteristics embodying economic and non-economic interests of the nation state. This slide lays out some of the categories where spillovers, economic spillovers, are different from the traditional economy to an innovation economy, and thus requires us to reevaluate acceptable foreign investment models to protect companies and allow them to accrue wealth that in turn benefits the economy. In the tangible economy, virtually all foreign investments, whether it's direct or portfolio, yield positive economic spillovers. However, in the intangible economy, these investments yield very different outcomes. Foreign direct investment takes the form of a business in one country possessing control or ownership in what is commonly known as a foreign branch plant in another, which manifests as a negative spillover in the innovation economy. In times of economic hardship, resulting in high rates of unemployment like we have seen with the impacts of COVID-19, it can be tempting for jurisdictions to prioritize job creation, one of the only economic benefits of a foreign branch plant, as the only lens for determining its value. While beneficial in the context of short-term employment opportunities, when the company is headquartered outside of the country, it often has the extractive effects in innovation dynamism and in important public goods. Strategic initiatives such as nationally led infrastructure, community or industrial cooperatives, and sound social policies have been at the core of healthy democracies for decades, even centuries. With the digital transformation, we need updated strategies, institutions, programs, and policies. All nations need the digital policy infrastructure to be well positioned for the opportunities and challenges of our current digital era. Public investment into these critical elements of digital policy infrastructure will determine the tenacity of a nation's ability to withstand hard times while also laying the foundations for the future. Following World War II, progressive leaders recognized that recovering on a global scale was going to require coordinated effort, and in turn created the Bretton Woods institutions. These institutions served us well as in an economic era characterized by constant returns to scale, and labor share of income was relatively stable. In the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, the Financial Stability Board was created to foster global financial cooperation and stability. The last decade has demonstrated that data-driven economies' effects cannot be contained within national borders. New approaches to international coordination and enforcement are critical as policymakers develop new frameworks to preserve competitive markets and democratic systems that evolved over centuries under profoundly different technological conditions. We need new or reformed rules of the road for digital-mediated global commerce, a World Trade Organization 2.0. A similar global institution I would call a Digital Stability Board is needed to deal with the challenges posed by digital transformation. In conclusion, there are many factors that help us map out how to collectively respond to the challenges presented before us, and I hope you will engage with the ideas I've put forward today. And I look forward to your questions and our discussion, and I thank you for your time.
Jim, thank you. This was an extremely rich presentation. There's so much here for us to explore. I want to start by apologizing. My internet connection seems to be a little bit unstable. So if I do freeze up, I've asked Rob if he can step in. But I had a couple of questions that I'd like to explore a little bit before we even turn to the Q&A, if you don't mind. There's actually so much here that I'd love to explore more deeply with you. I guess the first thing, coming from the Institute for New Economic Thinking, we've talked a lot about how older economic models don't actually work for the world we're in today, and how we really need to rethink some of the most fundamental ways in which neoclassical economics approaches the questions of how markets run. I think what you've pointed to is that particularly in the area of the digital transformation, we need to do a serious rethink of our models and what they look like. So our traditional models of capital and labor, with technology thrown in as, you know, an exponent at some point, or, you know, a coefficient that we can add on later, just doesn't seem to hack it anymore. So do you have thoughts on how we can actually incorporate in our models? What would a restructured economic model look like to fully incorporate the data transformation and AI and IP in the way that could create models that actually make sense for today's era?
That is a very, very good question. And I have thought a lot about it. I think that the structure of it is much more akin to colonialism, where you want to control the asset and extract rents, and people are sharecroppers, and it leads to great power rivalries. So because it's got a mercantilist and a naturally mercantilist structure to it. So and it's also extractive. The current data-driven economy is extractive of public good and turning into private good, principally in its capture of human autonomy. And then there's been unsubstantiated assertions that higher IP provisions generate innovation when it's unambiguous in all research that they constrain innovation. And so it leads to a kind of legally endorsed neo-feudalism where the rich get richer and not. So I think we have to bring in, I guess the expression I would use is, I often say I'd rather be generally right than perfectly wrong. And I think until we, and I've said a lot of things in this response to you, but until our models expressly factor these forces as a quantification or a category to be quantified. And that's why I threw out the spillovers, that we've got this traditional orthodoxy of the 3x spillover of the branch plant. Whereas very clearly in the ideas economy, it's to create negative spillovers where you just appropriate best talent at the lowest cost. And it's doing to tech, white collar, what it did to blue collar manufacturing. And it's exploitive. But when you did the branch plants, it put people on a development model where they can move up the value chain, whereas the way these frameworks work, I think they preempt the value chain. And therefore it has to, and it disables sovereign approaches. So I'm giving you a really long answer to a really good question. But I think if the models don't factor their essential elements, then you're just going to get into a deeper and deeper hole. And I think factoring them is an imperfect exercise. But as I said, you've got to start to factor them in. And what I'm trying to do in my late slide is my last 3 slides is get the directionality right. Though, of course, we can have lots of discussions on the exact nature and the degree of it. Long answer, but I hope that begins to answer your question.
It does. And, it's a very deep question. I don't think there are quick answers to it. So I really appreciate just, even taking any steps in that direction. It's a lot of what we've been struggling with at the Center for Innovation and Growth. Let me turn to the questions that we have here. I have one from Tom Ferguson, who's our Director of Research. He says, okay, so leading countries are mercantilist, but suppose you could write new regulations for a WTO 2.0. Which new ones would you propose as most important?
Well, that is a very fair question. And I would say the challenge of this is that is the WTO fit for purpose anymore? It was meant for the exchange of goods, and then they stuffed in TRIPS as a rent mechanism, which really doesn't naturally fit in its original structure. And the problem with dealing with, and then what happened was everyone in the West was pretty good with that until China said, I think I can outplay you on this with national strategies. And then all of a sudden, that created the collision. So everything went to TRIPS. The WTO puts minimals on the IP, but it doesn't put maximums. And so it's been ever raising, and China says, I'll go there. And then others, the West says, well, we never saw that coming. And nobody's a saint in these things. And then the problem with, and I will get to his question even more deeply, is that data embeds norms. And so, whereas, in a financial stability board, everybody had an incentive in stability post-crisis, but people do not have the same set of norms. So I think we're going to have reconfigured relationships in these institutions. My articulation to the United States has been that you're strongest when you lead with values. And I think if you recognize the supremacy of the human dignity, democracy, and sovereign future, that I think prosperity in the intangible economy and growth is unbounded. It's literally limitless, and nobody is better positioned to thrive in that than the United States. However, if it's going to become a kind of a protection racket, then the strength of the terrain shifts to China, because they offer pretty favorable terms. So I think if it's fixing the WTO, you're going to have to lead with norms. You're going to have to factor that what you trade crosses into other forms that are non-economic, and whether the WTO is fit for purpose anymore or whether it needs a new institution. These are enormously important questions. We've got the distributional elements of it, and we've generally dealt with distribution after the fact. But we haven't really thought about how we deal with it before the fact. And you have distributional issues between nations, which becomes mercantilists. And then you have distribution within the nations, which becomes the elite 1%. And some nations are saying, well, we'll be mercantilists around the world, and then we'll do maybe some considerations domestically. So that's why I say I think it's going to get bumpier before it gets easier. I do not see simple solutions to this. I'm not sitting here putting forward simple solutions, and I think we're in for a very, very time where the kind of work INET does, CIGI's doing, I think has to be dramatically heightened to on this. I do not come at this with any simple solutions.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about what happens to developing countries in this process?
Well, they're fundamentally disabled as a factor of production in the current models because they're cut off of the thickets of IP and the TRIPS maximalism, and then they're very much neutered in these data systems that are determined. They're a new factor of production, which means you're always just in that rent, you're that tenant state, and these factor of productions also are determinative of security and social structures. So I think we have to, I know that there's been some work on this and some of it's, the UN's done some, which has, had to do its watering down on it. I respect that because you're trying to become many tools at the same time. But I think this is another important issue. And I know you mentioned Rohinton is working on this in Africa, and he's got a long development history. And he understands these issues are very challenging. And of course, the data-driven economy is most effective when it triggers negative emotions, because that's what hijacks your economy very effectively based on our neural structures. And this is very, very damaging against the most vulnerable, particularly women and children in Africa. So I think we have to have a new development model. I think we have to lead with these new forces. And I think we have to give them freedom to operate in their own economies. I think we have to give them sovereignty in digital. And I think if there's a shrewd approach by the administration in Washington, again, it creates prosperity unbounded. And for US firms, it creates the norm spreading. But it's going to take an understanding of the nature of these forces and a bit of an enlightened view of the world, not a great power rivalry per se. And I think it's got enormous consequences for development, certainly Africa and elsewhere. We are in a time where we all know that we're feeling the effects of these, but we can't quite get our finger on what's causing it. And I'm trying to spend my time framing the nature of what's causing this, and then the imperative for more discussion and research on how do we craft solutions that are doable.
Right. I have a question here from Greg Wilpert. You quote a source as saying that patent filings are a measure of innovative input. Is this true? Given the importance of IP for today's economy, as you say, couldn't the increase in filings be a sign of increased competition on the basis of PTO filings instead of a measure of innovation? Alternatively, wouldn't it make sense to shift IP rules towards open access or Creative Commons principles and fund R&D by other methods?
Yeah, and I'm not, we're getting into very important definitional issues, and I'm more in his camp than I am in what I quoted there. So I'm not an advocate for it. As we measure innovation, it's the commercialization of ideas and the claiming of ideas based on legal restriction allows you to commercializing, and what that does for reducing dynamism and creating entrenched interests is something that I don't agree with. And so this unboundedness of the TRIPS provisions in trade agreements and people moving from the WTO to bilateral and multilateral, I've been very, very public in my criticism of what is generally called TRIPS plus provisions. And I think we have to, these used to be incentives to create, and now they've become a permanent stock asset structure. And I didn't want to get too technical in my presentation, but these trade agreements are now going to enormously detailed trade secret provisions with enormous punishments for breaking them. and trade secrets have permanent no time limit on them. So these agreements, these international agreements, I call them instruments for regulatory remote control, where the large power reaches in and structures how the smaller parties behave. And that's, as Dan Chiriak, I quoted, they're called asset value protection agreements. And is that a structure that creates innovation and fairness, as you know, and what's the open commons and the nature of your question? I think that's a very, very fair question. And I think that's a realm where INET could have something to say. As you know, I would argue that the USMCA went to TRIPS++ after the TPP's TRIPS+. And I mentioned how China's challenging the US in this kind of and you can see how the world's evolving that. So when I made that comment, please don't interpret it as an endorsement of that. I'm simply trying to say, this is a battle, this is a force, and this is a battle, and it's creating all these dynamics, and economics and assessment has to pay attention to it very systemically, but don't read it as an endorsement from me. Far from it. I've been very public in the criticism of it.
Okay, we have a question here from Pedro de Almeida. To what extent do you think an inherently centralized internet architecture plays a role in the market outcomes that you presented today? Should we be thinking instead of a more decentralized web as a first step towards achieving equitable growth in the intangible economy?
Well, that's an excellent question. And of course, the original sin, which Tim Berners-Lee would say, is he never got identity and security baked into the web. And and then the big companies were asking for net neutrality from the telcos so that they could be non-neutral in their directory management system. So I made a comment, which we've had a fair bit of engagement with the WTO, and they're editing their annual report right now. And they're starting to look at the spillovers of FDI, which is a really, really profound shift in orthodoxies. And then the other thing is that they're also acknowledging the greater role for public investment. And so I put some of that in that slide of the digital policy infrastructures, that do we want identity to be something that's done by private actors for private gain? I mean, you know, we were given identity by the state in the form of things like passports and driver's license, and they didn't attach normativeness to it. It just says you are who you are. So, you know, we can manage the decentralization by what roles have been used to leverage broader roles. We created public broadcasters, and I haven't fully unpacked the place for state investment, and it's been busy in other forms of the COVID, but I'm going to go there more and more on my time. But we created, going forward, but we created public broadcasters in an era when there was a shortage of content to tell national stories. And, but I would make a case that they may not have the same mandate they had decades ago, but should we not have a public algorithm on front of it that curates your stories for you without a business model of triggering negative emotions? So, and these could be much more national. So, you know, when you say decentralized what and decentralized by who, you have to break down what are the roles that are causing the leverage and causing the misbehavior. I think identity and presentation, shall we say, are two of them. You know, and again, I haven't fully flushed out my thinking on this, but I think the role and the nature of state investment, you know, in these functioning societies, you know, there was a time we decided libraries were public goods, etc. Water treatment's public goods. And in the digital era, what are the public goods and how do we protect the public goods? When my view of it is that the processor of the data should be construed akin as a fiduciary, akin to your doctor and your lawyer, because they have so much power over you that the data they have on you can be turned against you in the future in ways that you just can't foresee, and therefore they have a duty of care to you. Well, a private actor does not have a duty of care to you per se, although you could regulate that with very careful laws, or you put aspects of that into the public realm with very sophisticated, as kind of what we would call in Canada, crown corporations, with very sophisticated governance mechanisms into it, because you're managing normatively based public goods. And so, whether it's data trusts or data cooperatives or things like that. So, put those all in the category of, decentralized internet. To answer the question, I think that's a place worth enormous exploration by the researchers and by policy folks and certainly by INET. So, yeah, and I think we have to rethink models. But I think in this era of neoliberalism, we went to sleep on institutions and we just thought the market was the solution for everything. And I'm a capitalist. I believe in capitalism. Government, private industry should own the factors of production. I believe in technology. I believe in innovation. But I do not believe that markets are the solution to everything. And I think this is where we are missing it. And the digital has played a lot of games where they say, I'm for free speech and you can, okay, fine, I'll respect your privacy. And they play this gaslighting stuff that makes you think that they're working for, they're being fair to you, but really they're taking you off the scent of what's the core issue. So, and that goes to this centralized, decentralized question, which I think is an exceptional question and worthy of a lot of unpacking. It's going to start to go to who controls these decentralized pieces and what's the role of the state in this investment, in state investments in this era.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left, and I know Rob wanted to say a few words. So, Rob, if you can unmute.
Well, Jim, I must say, I don't think I misled. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
It's not, okay. I don't think I misled our audience about the power and the energy that you create when you bring these visions and these concerns before us. I've been running INET for over a decade, and I'm learning like I'm a kindergartner today. And this, and I see it within the building blocks of economics. When you talked about what is the nature of value and the nature of the good that creates value, and then it can be shared. It's not that, how would I say, I'm eating an apple and you only get the core. There are all kinds of ways in which win and win can take place. And there are all kinds of ways in which competition is fostered through very different mechanisms. What I found fascinating, and this is really the frame of my question, is scale matters. This public good nature of the value, what you might call the commodity or instrument that is our focal point, matters. And as a national government, you want to be a leader. You want to foster research and the notion of R&D so that the private sector and others can develop based on the basic science. But at another level now, you're proposing something where the nation that funds the research may see the benefits diffuse and be captured by other countries and not what you might call the people or the companies which your government may have an equity share in. So there's so much architecture in play here. There's so many things that are so foreign to the unconscious assumptions that economic theory has created. And you are breaking open an awareness. And I guess I would conclude my comment by saying that if I were asked by Joe Biden or Macron who should head the Digital Stability Board at its inception, I can't think of anybody better than you. I think, how would I say, sometimes the person who's at the core of envisioning an invention should lead the discovery and the trade-offs. I think you have a tremendous imagination and great credibility and experience that underpins that credibility.
Thank you. It's very kind of you. Very, very generous. Thank you. Especially coming from a man of your stature. I'm humbled. Thank you for saying it.
Thank you, Rob. And Jim, thank you again so much for taking the time to explore this framework with us. INET is driven by an understanding that economics must serve humanity. And I think what becomes very clear here is that your perspective is driven by the view that technology must serve humanity. And much of this is a question of how do we create the structures to actually get us there. So I have to agree with Rob. I'd love to see you have a hand in creating some of those structures.
I think we have to get the direction right. And I think there's a lot of misdirection by design I see in these things. So if we get the direction right, I think we're going to be okay.
Well, I can assure you, Jim, that your fellow Canadian Mike Spence will receive the presentation and the deck within hours. And you've opened, I'm very excited to open the discussion with him and others who are working on his subcommittee, including James Manika at the McKinsey Global Institute and others. I think this is a really good and refreshing challenge to the Commission to reach higher.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. See you all in September. Bye-bye.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.